Catherine Hart pressed herself against the wall and prayed no one would notice her. She had spent 8 long years perfecting the art of being forgotten. The right shade of gray, the right set of her shoulders, the right way to fold herself into nothing until she was less than wallpaper. And for 8 years it had worked. Until tonight. Until the moment Daniel Morgan stepped through those doors and swept his gaze across every glittering face in that ballroom. And stopped. Stopped on her. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel and follow Catherine's journey all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Catherine had worn gray on purpose. Not the soft pearl gray that wealthy women sometimes chose to appear modest while still drawing the eye. No, she had chosen the gray of old stone walls, of winter ash, of things people walk past without a second glance. She had chosen it the way a woman chooses armor, not for beauty, but for survival. She stood near the far end of the Harrington ballroom, her back almost touching the wall, a glass of lemonade in her hand that she had no intention of drinking. Around her, New York's finest swirled and laughed and touched each other's arms with practiced elegance. The summer heat pressed down through the tall windows. Candles threw gold across silk gowns and powdered hair, and the flashing teeth of women who had never once in their lives wished they could become invisible. Catherine had wished it every day for 8 years. She was watching Mrs. Aldridge's ridiculous hat, a towering arrangement of feathers that bobbed every time the woman threw her head back to laugh, when she heard it. The shift in the room. Not a sound exactly, more a change in pressure, the way the air feels different before a storm rolls in. Voices dropped half a note. Laughter softened at the edges, and Catherine knew, without turning her head, exactly what had caused it. Daniel Morgan had arrived. She heard his name move through the room like water through cracks. Morgan. That's Daniel Morgan. Is that Morgan? Lord, he looks... She did not turn to look. She had made a careful study of not looking at things that frightened her. He came, whispered Eliza Fenwick at her elbow, appearing from nowhere the way Eliza always did, breathless and bright-eyed, and utterly unaware that Catherine would have preferred to be alone. I didn't think he'd actually come. Did you hear he refused the Whitmore dinner twice? Twice, Catherine! And here he is. Here he is, Catherine agreed, keeping her eyes on Mrs. Aldridge's feathers. Don't you want to look? No. Catherine. Eliza's elbow found her ribs. Every woman in this room is looking. Then there are plenty of eyes on him already. He won't miss mine. Eliza made a small sound that was half laugh and half exasperation. And then she was gone again, pulled into the current of the crowd, and Catherine was alone again, which was exactly as she preferred it. She had almost convinced herself she was safe when she heard his footsteps. She had never heard Daniel Morgan's footsteps before. She had no reason to know their particular rhythm, the steady, unhurried weight of them. And yet something in her body recognized them the way it might recognize thunder, not with her ears first, but with the skin along the back of her neck, the sudden stillness that moved through her chest. She made herself look up. He was not looking at Mrs. Aldridge's hat. He was not looking at the gleaming chandelier overhead or the couples beginning to assemble for the first dance. He was looking at her, directly, without apology, the way a man looks at something he has been waiting a long time to see. Catherine felt the lemonade glass tremble in her hand and tightened her grip. He was closer than she'd expected. Not across the room. Not safely across the room. He was perhaps 15 feet away, and he was still moving. And every reasonable instinct she possessed was screaming at her to step sideways, to slip behind the nearest cluster of guests, to do what she did best and simply cease to exist in any way that might require acknowledgement. She didn't move. She couldn't explain later why she didn't move. Some stubbornness in her, maybe. Some small, exhausted part of her that was tired of moving. Daniel Morgan stopped in front of her. He was taller than she'd realized from a distance, broader through the shoulders, with a stillness about him that didn't read as calm, so much as contained, like something that had been held in check for a very long time. His eyes were dark, serious, and they were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously too seen and completely confused. "Miss Hart," he said. She stared at him. "You know my name." It came out before she could stop it, flat and slightly accusatory, and nothing like the polite, self-effacing response a woman in her position was supposed to give to a man like Daniel Morgan. She watched something shift in his expression. Not offense, almost the opposite. "I do," he said. "I don't—" She stopped, started again. "We haven't been introduced." "No," he agreed. "We haven't." "Then how—" "I've known your name for 8 years, Miss Hart." His voice was quiet, but it carried. Everything about him carried, she was beginning to understand. "I've simply been waiting for the right moment to use it." The words hit her somewhere she hadn't expected, somewhere soft and undefended, and for a moment she genuinely didn't know what to do with them. She looked away from his face, at the middle distance, at the swirling gowns and the laughing faces and the world that had spent 8 years looking straight through her. "I believe," she said carefully, "that you may be confusing me with someone else." "Catherine Hart," he said. "Daughter of the late Robert Hart of Hartford, Connecticut. Your mother was Eleanor Pace before she married. You came to New York in the spring of 1807. You attended the Worthington Assembly in June of that year." A pause. "You were wearing blue." Her head turned back to him before she could stop it. "You were wearing blue," he said again, steadily. "And you were the finest dancer in that room before the night went wrong. And you haven't danced since. Not once. In 8 years." She felt the color drain from her face and then rush back in a flood of heat she had no control over. 8 years. She had spent 8 years making sure that night was buried, making sure no one brought it up, making sure she moved through every social engagement since as quietly and invisibly as possible, so that nothing like it could ever happen again. She had been successful. No one talked about it anymore. No one even seemed to remember. He remembered. "I don't know what you think you know," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she deserved credit for. "But I assure you, Mr. Morgan, there is nothing particularly notable about my history." "I'd argue otherwise." "Then you'd be wrong." She made to step sideways. "If you'll excuse me, I was there that night," he said. She stopped. The ballroom noise continued around them, the chatter and the music warming up in the far corner, the laughter of people who had no idea what was happening in this small, charged pocket of space near the east wall. Catherine stood very still and stared at a point just past his left shoulder. "I was there," Daniel Morgan said, "when the Davenport women started their little performance. I was there when they laughed. I was there when the crowd turned." His voice hadn't changed in volume, but something in it had changed in texture, something rougher underneath. "I was 23 years old, and I was a coward, Miss Hart, because I stood there and I didn't stop it. And I have thought about that specific failure for every one of the last 8 years." She turned her eyes back to his face. He looked like a man confessing something he had been carrying for a long time, and had not yet decided whether the release of it felt like relief or recklessness. That is not, Catherine said slowly, a particularly comfortable thing to say to a person. No, I don't imagine it is. You're asking me to… what, exactly? Absolve you of something that happened 8 years ago at a party? No, his jaw set slightly. I'm not asking for absolution. I'm asking for a dance. The silence between them lasted 3 full seconds. No, Catherine said. Miss Hart, no, Mr. Morgan. She was surprised by the firmness in her own voice, by the fact that she could find any firmness at all when her heart was hammering against her ribs hard enough that she half expected him to hear it. I appreciate the gesture, or the confession, or whatever this is, but I don't dance. I haven't danced in 8 years. And the reason I don't dance is so that I never again have to stand in the center of a room while people decide I'm worth laughing at. So I think you'll understand when I say that the answer is no. He looked at her for a long moment. He didn't argue. He didn't push. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at something that has confirmed exactly what he suspected. They were wrong about you, he said. The people who laughed. They were cruel and they were wrong. And the fact that you've spent 8 years letting them win. He stopped himself, exhaled once through his nose. Forgive me, that wasn't my place. No, she agreed, it wasn't. I'll leave you be. He inclined his head slightly, the beginning of a bow. But I meant what I said, Miss Hart. I've known your name for 8 years. I'm not confused about who you are. He turned to leave. She watched him go, and she was absolutely furious with herself for the strange and completely irrational sensation that rose in her chest as the distance between them began to grow. It wasn't relief. She had spent 8 years knowing exactly what relief felt like, the specific easing of tension that came with successfully fading into the background. And this was not it. This was something else entirely, something with teeth in it, something that felt uncomfortably close to the particular desperation of watching a door close that you had not intended to close. Mr. Morgan, her own voice startled her. He stopped, turned back. How do you know, she said, that I was the finest dancer in the room? He held her gaze. Because I watched you, from the moment you arrived. You watched me? She tasted the words, tried to understand the shape of them. All evening? All evening, he confirmed. You moved like the music was inside you, rather than around you. I thought I'd never seen anything quite like it. A beat. I still haven't. The musicians in the corner had found their rhythm now, the opening notes of a cotillion filling the room, and couples were beginning to claim the floor. Catherine looked at the dancers. She looked at their confident hands and their easy smiles, and the effortless way they inhabited the center of a room, as though no one had ever told them they didn't belong there. She looked back at Daniel Morgan. I don't remember the steps, she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. I don't believe that, he said. You should. 8 years is a long time. Your body remembers things your fear would rather it forgot. He said it simply, matter-of-factly, without sentiment. That's not an opinion. That's just the truth of how people work. She looked at his extended hand. She looked at his face. She looked at the dance floor, at the waiting space of it, at all the eyes that weren't on her at the moment, but would be the instant she stepped out there. And she felt the old familiar cold move through her, the one she'd learned to live inside of, the one that had kept her safe and small and unnoticed and untouchable for 8 years. If I make a fool of myself, she said quietly, I'll never forgive you. If you make a fool of yourself, he said, just as quietly, I'll be standing right beside you. She stared at his hand for one more moment, long enough to feel the full weight of the choice she was about to make. Then she set her lemonade glass down on the narrow table behind her, smoothed the front of her gray dress with fingers that were only slightly unsteady, and took Daniel Morgan's hand. The warmth of his grip surprised her. It was steadier than she'd expected, more certain than anything had any right to be, and when he led her toward the floor, she kept waiting for the ground to shift under her feet, for the ceiling to press down, for the crowd to turn, the way it had once before, in a blue dress, in a different ballroom, when she had been young enough to believe that the worst thing that could happen was someone laughing at her. No one laughed. No one did anything except continue their own dancing, their own conversations, their own small dramas. The world, it turned out, was not waiting to perform her humiliation again. The world was simply moving, the way it always moved, indifferent and uninterested in her particular terror. She remembered the steps. They came back the way he said they would, before she'd taken 3 of them, her feet finding the rhythm with a muscle memory that 8 years of deliberate disuse hadn't managed to kill. She heard it, a small sound she didn't intend to make, half breath and half something she couldn't name, when she realized her body still knew how to do this, still knew the shape of it, the arc of it, the way the music could live inside you if you let it. Daniel Morgan noticed. She could tell by the way his hand tightened fractionally around hers. "Don't look at them," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "Look at me." "I'm not looking at them," she said. "You're thinking about looking at them." She almost laughed. She caught it before it escaped, pressed it back behind her teeth, and was surprised by how much effort that required. Surprised to discover that something in his company wanted to be lighter than 8 years of careful gravity had prepared her to be. They moved through the first figure, then the second. Catherine kept her eyes on his face and her breathing steady, and her mind focused on the mechanics of it, the placement of her feet, the angle of her arm, anything technical and controllable. And gradually, so gradually she almost didn't notice it happening, the mechanical gave way to something else. The music found her, the way it always used to, the way she'd spent 8 years pretending it couldn't. "You're angry," Daniel Morgan said. She looked at him. "I beg your pardon?" "When you first stepped onto the floor, you were angry." "I was terrified," she corrected, before she thought better of it. "At first," he said. "And then you were angry, when your feet remembered." He turned her through a figure with a sureness that didn't announce itself. "You were angry that they still could, that they'd been capable this whole time." She didn't answer. "Because that means the last 8 years," he said carefully, "weren't something that was done to you. They were something you chose." The words landed hard. She felt them in her chest, in the back of her throat, in the particular way the truth sometimes feels less like revelation and more like a bruise you've had so long you forgot you weren't born with it. "That's a very harsh thing to say," she told him. "Yes," he didn't apologize. "It is." They completed another figure in silence. Somewhere in the room, she was distantly aware of eyes turning toward them. Not cruelly, just with the ordinary curiosity that attaches itself to unexpected things. The cool, controlled Daniel Morgan dancing with the gray woman from the wall. "Why?" she asked. "Why what?" "Why any of this?" She met his eyes directly, something she'd been carefully avoiding for most of the dance. "Why tonight? Why me? You could have—" She stopped, looked for the right words. "You could have left it alone." "All of it. You could have left me alone." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that felt like something being carefully considered rather than avoided. "I've watched you make yourself smaller for 8 years, he said at last. "I've watched you come to every event you were obligated to attend, and stand at the edges, and wear the kind of clothes that tell people not to look. And I've watched you do it with a dignity that most people in this room couldn't manage if they tried." His voice stayed even. But you are not a woman meant for the edges, Miss Hart. And the people who put you there were wrong. They were wrong when they did it, and they're still wrong. And I decided a long time ago that if I ever got the opportunity to say so plainly, I would. Catherine Hart looked at Daniel Morgan in the candlelight of the Harrington Ballroom in the summer of 1815, in a gray dress she had chosen to make herself disappear. "You've been waiting to say that for 8 years?" she said. "Longer," he said simply. The music came to its close, the dancers stilled. Around the room, the polite sound of applause rose and fell, and Catherine stood on the dance floor, not at the edge, not pressed against the wall, not arranged carefully in the geometry of invisibility. And she breathed. One breath, then another. She was in the center of the room, and she was still standing. She was still standing, and that was the part she hadn't planned for. Catherine had rehearsed 100 versions of how the evening might go wrong. She had prepared herself, as she always did, for the particular variety of humiliation that came from being too visible in a room full of people who had long ago decided she wasn't worth looking at. What she had not prepared herself for was this: the absence of catastrophe, the quiet afterward, the strange, unsteady feeling of having done the thing she feared most and found that the floor had not opened up to swallow her. Daniel Morgan released her hand with the same unhurried certainty with which he had taken it, and he bowed, properly, without irony, the way a man bows when he means it. And Catherine dipped a curtsy on legs that felt less reliable than she would have preferred. "Thank you," he said. "I'm not sure what for," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more restrained than that. For not walking away. He left her there, at the edge of the floor, and Catherine stood for a moment that lasted approximately 10,000 years before she was able to make her feet carry her back toward the wall, back toward the familiar geometry of the room's margins, and breathe. Eliza found her in under a minute. "Catherine Ann Hart," Eliza said, arriving at her shoulder with the velocity of a woman who had been watching from across the room and had physically restrained herself until she could restrain herself no longer. "You danced." "I noticed." "With Daniel Morgan." "I noticed that as well." "Catherine," Eliza grabbed her arm and turned her, not roughly, but with the insistence of genuine feeling. Her eyes were wide. "You danced with Daniel Morgan, and I am going to need you to explain to me, in full detail, beginning from the moment he walked toward you, everything that just happened. Because from where I was standing, it looked like the two of you were having a conversation that was either a marriage proposal or a funeral, and I cannot tell which." Despite everything, despite the unsteady rhythm of her own heartbeat and the strange rawness she felt in her chest, Catherine almost smiled. "Neither," she said. "We simply talked." People who simply talk do not look at each other the way the two of you were looking at each other. "Eliza, he never dances," Eliza pressed on, undeterred. "In 3 years of attending every social event this city produces, I have never once seen Daniel Morgan ask a woman to dance. And tonight, he walked across the Harrington Ballroom, past every eligible woman in New York, and stopped in front of you." A pause. "In your gray dress." "I'm aware of what I'm wearing." "Are you aware of what it means?" "It means I was cold when I left the house," Catherine said flatly, and she watched Eliza's expression collapse into the particular frustrated affection of a woman dealing with someone she loved who was being willfully obtuse. "He didn't ask anyone else," Eliza said, softer now. "The whole room saw it, Catherine. Whatever you say happened between the two of you tonight, the whole room saw it happen." That was the thing Catherine had been trying very carefully not to think about. The whole room had seen her step onto that floor. The whole room had seen her take his hand. The whole room, or at least enough of the whole room to matter, had watched her move through those figures with a man who never danced, in a gray dress that was supposed to make her disappear. And the whole room was now, she was perfectly certain, talking about it. She looked out across the gathering, and she found she was right. There were eyes on her. Not everyone's, not even most people's, but enough. Clusters of conversation that she couldn't hear from this distance, but could read in the tilt of heads, the lowering of fans, the sideways glances that pulled back just a half-second too late when she looked their direction. She had spent 8 years becoming invisible, and in the space of one dance, she had undone all of it. She should have been more afraid than she was. That was the thing that surprised her. The fear she expected to feel was there, yes, but underneath it was something else. Something she didn't have a clean name for yet. Something that sat in her chest with a warmth she didn't entirely trust. "I need some air," she told Eliza. "Catherine, I'm not running," she said, and meant it. "I just need a moment." She moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent years learning how to navigate a room without disturbing it, slipping between conversations, threading through the spaces between people, until she reached the far side of the room, where the press of bodies thinned and the noise dropped by half a degree. She had almost reached the corridor when Margaret Davenport stepped into her path. Catherine stopped. 8 years hadn't changed Margaret Davenport in any of the ways that mattered. She was still beautiful in the particular architectural way of women who had been told so consistently from childhood that they built their entire identity on the structural integrity of their cheekbones. She was still carrying herself with that particular tilt of the chin that communicated, without words, that she considered most of the people in any given room to be obstacles between herself and the center of it. She was also smiling, which was worse than if she hadn't been. "Catherine Hart," Margaret said, warmly, terribly warmly. "I thought that was you on the dance floor. My goodness, it's been an age." "Margaret," Catherine said, "I almost didn't recognize you." The smile held. "You've changed your hair. Or, no, it's the color of that dress, isn't it? So unusual. So—" The briefest pause, perfectly placed. "Understated." Catherine felt the old cold move through her, the specific cold of a room turning, of laughter gathering at the edges of things. "Thank you," she said evenly. "And dancing with Mr. Morgan, of all people." Margaret tilted her head. The smile hadn't moved. "You must tell me how you managed that. The man is practically a ghost at these events. Never speaks to anyone, never dances, never—" Another pause, another perfect beat of timing. "Well, almost never, I suppose." "He asked," Catherine said. "I accepted. That's generally how it works." Something shifted behind Margaret's eyes. The smile stayed, but the warmth behind it recalibrated into something cooler. "Of course. Well." She touched Catherine's arm lightly, the briefest contact. "It's lovely to see you participating again, truly. After all this time." She moved past. Catherine stood very still and let her go, and refused to allow any part of herself to collapse. "She hasn't changed," said a voice to her left. She turned. Daniel Morgan was standing close enough that he'd clearly heard the whole exchange. His expression was the particular stillness of a man who had exercised significant self-control in the last 30 seconds. "Were you following me?" Catherine asked. "I was standing here when you walked into that conversation," he said. "I made a decision not to intervene." "The right decision," she said immediately. "I know." His jaw moved. It didn't make it easier to stand there. She looked at him. "I don't need someone to fight my battles, Mr. Morgan." "No," he agreed. "You've been fighting them yourself for 8 years. I'm aware." "Then you understand why—" "What I understand," he said, "is that you handled that with more grace than she deserved. and that the fact that you can stand there and be gracious to a woman who did what she did is either the most impressive thing I've seen tonight or the saddest, and I haven't fully decided which." He said it without cruelty, without softness, straight and level as a fence post. "Probably both." Catherine looked away from him. She looked at the place in the crowd where Margaret Davenport had disappeared, all gleaming hair and architectural cheekbones, and 8-year-old cruelty wrapped in a smile. "What she did," Catherine said carefully. "Do you mean the night of the Worthington Assembly?" "Yes. You said you were there." "I was." She turned back to face him. "Then you know it was a small thing. A moment of laughter. Society laughs at people all the time." She heard her own voice saying it, the efficient, sensible, self-protective shape of it. The way she'd trained herself to talk about that night in the years when she'd still been occasionally forced to talk about it at all. "It wasn't the end of the world." "No," Daniel Morgan said. "It wasn't." He looked at her steadily. "But you've been living like it was." The words hit somewhere they had no business hitting. She felt her breath catch and covered it by straightening her spine, by squaring her shoulders, by performing the particular posture of a woman who was fine, who had always been fine, who had spent 8 years being fine. "You don't know me well enough to say that," she told him. "I know what I've watched," he said. "Watching someone from across a room for 8 years doesn't mean you know them." "No," he agreed. "That's why I walked across it tonight." She stared at him. He stared back. The noise of the room moved around them, and they stood in the eye of it, this strange, charged space they kept finding themselves in. And Catherine was acutely aware of how little she understood about what was happening, about what any of it meant, about why a man like Daniel Morgan, cold, contained, sought after in every room he entered, had walked past every easier woman in New York and stopped in front of her gray dress. "Why me?" she said. Not the polished version of the question she'd asked on the dance floor. The real one. The one with a rawness in it. He was quiet for a moment. A real moment, not a performed one. "Do you remember," he said slowly, "the night of the Worthington Assembly? After the crowd turned. After the laughter started." His voice stayed even, but there was something working underneath it. "Do you remember what you did?" She didn't answer. She remembered every second of that night, with the specific, excruciating clarity of something you wished you could forget. "You didn't cry," he said. "You didn't flee. You didn't yell at them, or beg them, or try to explain yourself." He paused. "You stood in the center of that floor, and you looked at every single face in that room, one by one, and you didn't look away from a single one of them. And then you walked off that floor with your head up." Another pause. Longer. "I was 23 years old, and I'd never seen anything braver in my life. And I was a coward who stood and watched. And I have been angry about that specific moment of my own cowardice ever since." Catherine realized she had stopped breathing at some point in the last several sentences. She made herself start again. "That isn't—" She stopped. Her voice wasn't entirely steady. "That's not bravery. That was stubbornness. That was pride. I was too proud to let them see me break." "All right," he said. "Tell me the difference." She opened her mouth, closed it, found she didn't have an answer that satisfied her. "There are a dozen women in this room tonight," Daniel Morgan said, "who would have been on the floor in tears. There are a dozen more who would have pretended to faint so they could be carried out with their dignity theoretically intact. You stood up straight, and you looked them all in the face, and you walked." He held her gaze. "That woman didn't become invisible. She just stopped letting people see her. There's a difference, Miss Hart, a very significant one." She felt something in her chest that she had no framework for, something that wasn't comfortable, something that felt like the particular discomfort of being seen accurately after spending years managing how much of yourself was available to be seen. "You make it sound like a choice I made consciously," she said. "Didn't you?" "I made it out of—" She stopped, searched for the honest word. "Fear. I made it out of fear." "Fear is a reason," he said. "It's not an excuse. And it's not permanent." His eyes didn't move from hers. "Unless you decide to let it be." She was about to answer. She didn't know what she was about to say, only that something in her was building toward a response that might have cracked her open if she'd let it. When the sound reached her. Laughter. Not the polite musical variety. The other kind. The kind she knew in her bones. The kind that had a target in it. A sharpness at the edges. The kind of laughter that was never fully about what it claimed to be about. She turned toward it instinctively, the way you turn toward the sound of something breaking, and she saw, across the room, a small group of women that she recognized by silhouette alone. Margaret Davenport at the center of them, fan raised, speaking behind it while the women around her laughed in that particular muffled way that made it worse rather than better. They were looking in her direction. Catherine felt the cold close over her like water. Every muscle in her body went to its trained default. Stand still. Look away. Make yourself smaller. Give them nothing to aim at. 8 years of practice. 8 years of perfect reflexive response. But she didn't move. She didn't move, and she didn't look away. And she felt Daniel Morgan standing 2 feet to her left, and she didn't look at him either. Because whatever happened next, she needed to feel it happen without his face in it, without borrowing steadiness from anywhere outside herself. Margaret Davenport glanced over. Their eyes met across the room. Margaret smiled, the same smile as before, all surface, no warmth, and underneath it something that was either triumph or the anticipation of it. Catherine looked at her for 5 full seconds. Then she turned away first, not because she was retreating. She was done explaining that distinction to herself. She turned away because she had chosen to, and that was the only reason that mattered. And the difference between those 2 things was everything. "I need to ask you something," she said to Daniel Morgan, keeping her voice low and level. "Ask." "The night of the Worthington Assembly." She kept her eyes forward, kept her breathing even. "The laughter. It started with the Davenport women, and I always believed it was—" She stopped, chose the next words carefully. "I always believed it was spontaneous, that I simply did something that struck them as ridiculous, and they laughed, and others followed." A beat. Was that what happened? The silence lasted 1 second too long, 1 second that told her everything before he said a word. "Mr. Morgan." "It wasn't spontaneous," he said. The room continued around her. The music, the conversation, the summer heat pressing through the tall windows, all of it continuing as if the ground had not just shifted under her feet. "Tell me," she said. "Catherine, tell me." He exhaled. They planned it. Margaret Davenport and her sister and 2 others. I heard them discussing it in the anteroom before the dancing began. They had decided, for reasons I will not insult you by pretending were anything other than petty cruelty, that you needed to be taken down a level. You had come to New York with your family's reputation still intact, and your dancing drawing more attention than they were comfortable with. So they arranged it. His voice had gone flat, controlled. The voice of a man keeping something very large in a very small space. They waited until you were at the center of the floor, and then one of them made a comment, loudly enough to carry, and the others laughed on cue, and it spread the way those things spread, because people are cowards in crowds. Catherine stood very still. "It was arranged," she said. "Yes." "The worst night of my life," she said, "was arranged." "Yes. I spent 8 years." She stopped. The sentence had too many places it could go. 8 years building walls. 8 years wearing gray. 8 years arriving late and leaving early, and standing at the edges and measuring the precise minimum of herself required to fulfill a social obligation without attracting the kind of attention that could be turned into a weapon. 8 years. For something that was arranged in an anteroom by 4 women with nothing better to do with their cruelty. 8 years, she said, and it came out quieter than she intended. "I know," he said, "and I am sorry. I should have. That night, when I heard them planning it, I should have walked out of that anteroom and found you and warned you. And I didn't." His voice shifted, just slightly, but she heard it. "I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself I didn't know you. I told myself a great many things that were technically accurate and entirely insufficient." She turned and looked at him. His face was doing something complicated. Not guilt, exactly. Something older than guilt. Something that had been sitting with itself for long enough to become something quieter and more permanent. The face of a man who had made a decision 8 years ago that he had been measuring himself against every day since. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked. "Because for 6 of those 8 years," he said, "every time I saw you at one of these events, you looked at me, and everyone else, with a face that said clearly that you wanted nothing from this room or anyone in it. And I respected that. I respected you enough to leave it alone." He paused. "And because I knew that if I told you, and you were still in the place you were in, it would only make things worse to know it had been deliberate." "And tonight?" "Tonight you danced," he said simply. "Tonight you were different." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the certainty in his face, the steadiness of it, the way he looked back at her without flinching, without softening, without offering her any version of the truth that was easier to swallow than the real one. "You've been watching me," she said slowly, "for 8 years. Waiting for me to be ready. Waiting for you to be willing," he said. "There's a difference." "That is," Catherine said carefully, "either the most patient thing I've ever heard, or the most unsettling." "Probably both," he said. And despite everything, the coal that was still moving through her, the 8 years sitting freshly in her chest like a wound that had been closed improperly and was only now being opened right, despite all of it, something in her shifted. Something that had been braced for impact slowly, cautiously, uncertainly, released the breath it had been holding. She looked back across the room. Margaret Davenport was still there, still holding court, still laughing behind her fan. 8 years of cruelty dressed up in silk and smiles, and Catherine had let it build a life inside her, had let it move into the empty rooms of her and put down roots. She thought about the woman who had walked off that floor with her head up 8 years ago. She thought about what Daniel Morgan had said, that she hadn't become invisible, that she had stopped letting people see her, that there was a difference. She thought about gray dresses. "I'd like another glass of lemonade," she said. Daniel Morgan looked at her. "Is that a metaphor?" "No," she said. "I'm simply thirsty." A beat. "But I would not object to company." He fell into step beside her, and they moved through the room together, not hidden, not pressed against any wall. And the noise of the gathering moved around them, and Catherine Hart, in her gray dress, walked through the center of it like a woman who had just remembered something important about herself, and was not yet sure what to do with the remembering, but was, for the first time in 8 years, entirely willing to find out. The lemonade was too sweet, and Catherine drank it anyway. She stood beside Daniel Morgan at the edge of the refreshment table, and she drank her lemonade, and she was aware, with the specific awareness of a woman who had spent 8 years monitoring every room she entered, that the social temperature around them had changed. Not dramatically. Not the way it had changed 8 years ago in a different ballroom, with laughter and the particular cruelty of a crowd that had decided on its target. This was different. This was the shift that happens when people begin to recalibrate, when something they thought they understood about the social order shows a crack, and they aren't sure yet whether it's a flaw or a feature. People were watching, some openly, most with the practiced sideways attention of people who considered themselves too well-bred for outright staring. She felt it the way she always felt attention, like a change in the air pressure around her body, and she made herself stand still inside it and not shrink. "You're doing it again," Daniel Morgan said. "Doing what?" "Counting them." She looked at him. "Counting who?" "The people watching us." He wasn't looking at the room. He was looking at her, which was somehow more disorienting than if he had been cataloging the crowd. "You go very still when you're counting. Like, if you don't move, they might stop." That's an astute observation for a man I've known for approximately 2 hours. "I've had 8 years of preliminary study," he said. She almost smiled again. She was doing that more than she'd expected tonight, almost smiling, catching herself, the expression dying somewhere between impulse and execution, leaving behind only the faint residue of what it might have been. "Does it concern you, being watched?" "No." Simple, matter of fact. "I stopped caring what this room thought of me a long time ago." "Must be a comfortable place to live," she said, and heard the edge in her own voice before she could soften it. He heard it too. "It wasn't comfortable to get to," he said quietly. "I can tell you that." She looked at him properly then, the way she'd been carefully not looking at him for most of the last hour, taking in the particular set of his jaw, the slight tension at the corners of his eyes that she was beginning to understand was not coldness, but something more like vigilance. The controlled exterior of a man who had learned the hard way that the world reads whatever you put on the surface, so you'd better be deliberate about what you show it. She recognized that, more than she was comfortable recognizing it. "What made you stop caring?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "My father's death," he said finally. 4 years ago. He spent his whole life managing what this city thought of the Morgan name, what they thought of his money, his decisions, his family. He was exhausted by it. He died exhausted by it. A pause. "I decided I didn't want that to be the shape of my life." "I'm sorry," she said. "About your father." "Thank you." He said it simply, without deflecting, without the reflexive social performance of grief management. Just, "Thank you." She found she respected that more than she knew how to say. Before she could respond, she heard her name. Not said to her, said about her. She'd had enough practice distinguishing between the two to know immediately which it was, the particular shape of a name used as a subject rather than an address, and she tracked it to her right without appearing to move her head. 2 women, standing close together, one of them with a fan moving at a pace that indicated genuine agitation. The one speaking, Mrs. Hartwell, whose husband had done some kind of business with Catherine's father years ago, and who had never, in Catherine's recollection, said a kind word about anyone, was watching the 2 of them with an expression that she recognized as the precursor to an opinion about to be shared widely and without invitation. "She's going to say something unfortunate," Catherine said. Daniel didn't look. "Mrs. Hartwell?" "You saw." "I heard," he said. "She's been working up to it for the last 5 minutes." A beat. "Ignore her." "I've been ignoring people like her for 8 years," Catherine said. "I'm exceptionally good at it." "I know. That's not what I mean." He turned to face her more fully. "I mean, let her say it. Let her have her opinion. Stop spending your energy on the anticipation. She looked at him. That's easy advice for someone who... Miss Hart. The voice came from her right. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, the length of a breath, and opened them and turned. Mrs. Hartwell had made her decision and crossed the distance and was now standing 3 feet away with the bright, dangerous smile of a woman who had convinced herself that what she was about to do was in some way socially responsible. "How lovely to see you this evening," Mrs. Hartwell said, and her eyes moved to Daniel with a significance that she didn't bother to conceal. "And Mr. Morgan, of course. What a surprise to see the two of you together." "Good evening, Mrs. Hartwell," Catherine said. "We were just commenting on on the dancing earlier." The fan accelerated. "Such a lovely sight. It's been so long since you've participated. We were beginning to worry, weren't we, that you'd become quite the recluse." A light laugh. Friendly on the surface, the kind of friendly that had nails in it. "But here you are." "Here I am," Catherine agreed. "And looking so... well." Mrs. Hartwell's gaze moved briefly, comprehensively, over Catherine's gray dress. "You always did have your own sense of style, Catherine." "Unique," said Daniel Morgan. Both women looked at him. "Her sense of style is unique," he said, pleasantly, without inflection, looking directly at Mrs. Hartwell with the particular brand of contained attention that, Catherine was learning, meant he was approximately 30 seconds from saying something that would end a conversation permanently. "Most women in this room are wearing what's expected of them. Miss Hart wears what she chooses. I find that considerably more interesting." Mrs. Hartwell opened her mouth, closed it. The fan stilled. "Well," she said finally, "yes, quite." She removed herself from the conversation with somewhat less grace than she had arrived in it, and Catherine watched her go and felt something that was not quite satisfaction, but lived in the same neighborhood. "You didn't need to do that," she told him. "I know." He looked entirely unapologetic. "I wanted to." She shook her head, but the almost smile was back, and this time it made it slightly further toward actual expression before she caught it. They were still standing there when Eliza returned, flushed and bright, and carrying an expression that Catherine recognized as the face Eliza wore when she had been gathering information and could no longer contain it. "I need to speak with you," Eliza said, "privately." Catherine looked at her. "What's happened?" "Not here." Eliza took her arm with the gentle firmness of a woman who had decided something needed to happen and was not prepared to negotiate the timing. She glanced at Daniel. "Forgive us, Mr. Morgan." "Of course," he said, and there was something in his eyes, a question, briefly, that he didn't ask, as they moved away from him. Eliza pulled her into the corridor, where the noise of the gathering dropped behind them, and the air was a degree cooler, and the press of bodies gave way to the simpler geography of a hallway that contained only the two of them. "Tell me," Catherine said. "I spoke with Jane Aldridge," Eliza said, without preamble. Jane Aldridge, whose husband moved in financial circles, whose mother had been at the Worthington Assembly, who knew more about the architecture of New York's social world than anyone Catherine could think of. "She told me something. About Daniel Morgan." Eliza's voice had dropped, and there was something underneath its usual brightness now, something more careful. "Catherine, did he tell you anything about why he's been... about his history with you?" "He told me he was at the Worthington Assembly, that he felt he should have stopped what happened." A pause. "That he'd known my name for 8 years. Eliza pressed her lips together. "That's not all of it." The certainty in her voice landed like a stone in still water. Catherine felt the ripples move through her. "Tell me what Jane told you." 2 years ago," Eliza said slowly, "Margaret Davenport went to Daniel Morgan's mother. Mrs. Morgan was still alive then, before she passed last winter, and she was known to be social-minded, concerned with the family name. Margaret told her that she and Daniel had an understanding, that they were moving toward an engagement. Catherine stared at her. Were they? No. Eliza's voice was emphatic. That's the point. There was no understanding. Margaret invented it entirely, or greatly elaborated on some minimal social interaction, and she told Mrs. Morgan, and Mrs. Morgan apparently applied considerable pressure on Daniel to formalize things. A pause. He refused, categorically and, according to Jane, rather publicly. He told his mother, in front of at least 2 witnesses, that he would not marry Margaret Davenport if she were the last woman in New York. And when his mother asked why, he said, Eliza stopped. Eliza. He said he was already waiting for someone. The corridor went very quiet. Catherine became aware of her own heartbeat, not the panic percussion of the dance floor, or the cold drumming of standing in Margaret Davenport's path. This was something slower and more fundamental, like the heartbeat of something waking up. He didn't say who? She said. Jane doesn't know. No one seems to know. Eliza was watching her face with the careful attention of a woman who loved her and was trying to determine how much damage was being done. Catherine, if he meant don't, Catherine said. But don't, she said again, more gently. I need to think before anyone says the rest of that sentence. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Are you all right? I don't know what I am, Catherine said honestly. And then, before she'd consciously decided to say it, he told me tonight that the Worthington Assembly was arranged, that it wasn't spontaneous, that Margaret and the others planned it. Eliza went still. What? He was in the anteroom. He heard them discussing it. Catherine. Eliza's voice had changed entirely. The brightness was gone, replaced by something more fundamental, a kind of anger that Catherine recognized as the anger of someone who loved you and had just learned they'd been cheated on your behalf. 8 years. You spent 8 years. I know. Because of something they planned. I know, Eliza. She did it deliberately, and then she stood in this room tonight and smiled at you with that face. I know. Catherine's voice came out very quiet, very steady. The steadiness cost her something, but she paid it. I know all of it. I've had the last 30 minutes to begin understanding what it means. What it means, Eliza repeated with controlled fury, is that you have been living inside a cage they built, and they have been watching you do it for 8 years and smiling about it. Catherine closed her eyes, opened them. Yes, that's one way to put it. What's the other way? The other way, Catherine said, is that it was a cage I chose to stay in, after the lock had long since been removed. She heard herself saying it and recognized it as the truth, the clean, uncomfortable version of it, the one that Daniel Morgan had offered her in plain language on the dance floor, and that she'd been arguing with in the privacy of her own chest ever since. I chose to stay small. I chose the gray dress and the wall and the careful arithmetic of making myself cost nothing. And they put me there, but I decided to keep living there. And that is... She stopped, breathed. That is something I am only beginning to understand the size of. Eliza looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped forward and took both of Catherine's hands in hers, firmly, the way you hold on to someone who is standing at the edge of something, and you want them to feel the weight of another person on the other side. Come back inside, Eliza said. Come back inside and hold your head up and let that woman see that she didn't win. Catherine squeezed her hands. Give me a moment. Eliza nodded and left her there, and Catherine stood in the corridor and breathed, and let the noise of the gathering wash over her from the other side of the wall, and thought about 8 years, about gray dresses, about the specific architecture of a life built around not being seen. She was still standing there when she heard the footsteps. Not Daniel's this time. She was beginning to know the particular weight of his step, which was an entirely new and unsettling development. But something quicker, more deliberate. And she turned to find Margaret Davenport in the corridor. Alone. The performance of warmth was gone. The smile was gone. What was left was the face underneath all of it. The face of a woman who had made a calculation and was prepared to deliver the result of it plainly. "I think," Margaret said, "we should speak honestly." "I think," Catherine said, "that might be the first genuinely interesting thing you've ever said to me." Something shifted in Margaret's expression. "Daniel Morgan is not what you think he is." "I don't believe I've told you what I think he is." "He has a reputation in this city." "For being private and formidable, yes." Catherine kept her voice even. "I'm familiar with his reputation." "For being—" Margaret paused, and for the first time, underneath the architecture of all that practiced social confidence, Catherine saw something that it took her a moment to name. She named it slowly, reluctantly, because it rearranged something about the last 8 years in a way she hadn't expected. Fear. Not of Catherine. Of Daniel. Of whatever he had said, or was saying, or might yet say. "He has been fixated," Margaret said, and the word had an edge of desperation in it that she was working hard to conceal. "On you specifically. For years. I don't know what he's told you this evening, but I want you to consider the possibility that a man who watches a woman from across rooms for 8 years without approaching her is not a romantic hero. He is a man with a problem." The words were targeted, precise, chosen to land in the exact place where a woman who already doubted her own judgment would feel them most. Catherine felt them land. She felt the impact, the brief shudder of uncertainty, the old reflexive response to anything that confirmed she should be more afraid of the world than she was letting herself be. And then she thought about Eliza's voice in the corridor. He said he was already waiting for someone. She thought about Daniel Morgan standing 2 feet away while Mrs. Hartwell smiled her nailed smile, and saying, "Her sense of style is unique." She thought about a dance floor and a man who had told her the truth when he didn't have to, who had confessed a cowardice when he could have simply performed absolution, who had said the people who laughed were wrong with the directness of a man who had been carrying that statement for 8 years and was tired of holding it alone. "Margaret," Catherine said. "Yes?" "I know about the Worthington Assembly." She watched Margaret's face. Watched the architecture of it hold for 1 second, then 2, then develop the specific hairline fracture of a surface under pressure. "I know it was planned. I know you discussed it in the anteroom. I know there were 4 of you, and that you decided on your target in advance, and that the laughter was orchestrated." Margaret said nothing. "I want you to understand something," Catherine continued. Her voice was steady. Not angry, not cold, not performing any emotion she didn't feel. Just steady. Just true. "I am not going to pretend the last 8 years didn't happen the way they happened. I'm not going to pretend you didn't put something in motion that I chose to let define me. But I am also not going to stand in this corridor and let you use my own uncertainties as a weapon. Because you have been doing that for 8 years, and I am finished letting you." Margaret's chin lifted. The professional smile was trying to reassemble itself, and not quite managing. "You don't know what you're getting into." "No," Catherine agreed. "I don't." And then, because it was true, and because the truth had begun to feel like something she owed herself. "But I know that for the first time in 8 years, I'm genuinely curious to find out." She walked back into the ballroom. Her head was up. Her back was straight. Her gray dress moved around her as she crossed the threshold. And she did not look at the walls, did not seek the edges, did not begin the silent arithmetic of minimum visible presence. She walked into the center of it, into the noise and the heat and the press of all those eyes that had watched her dance earlier and hadn't yet decided what to make of her. And she held her ground inside it like a woman who had just remembered that she had every right to be there. Daniel Morgan was standing near the far side of the room. He saw her the moment she came through the door. She knew because something in his posture changed, a fractional shift, like a compass needle finding north. He crossed toward her without hurrying, and the room parted around him the way it always did. And when he reached her, he stopped and looked at her face with the careful attention of a man reading something important. "You spoke to her," he said. "Margaret came to find me in the corridor," Catherine said. "She had things to say." "I imagine she did." His eyes were steady on hers. "Are you all right?" "I am," she said. And then, because she had decided in the last 10 minutes to try the radical practice of saying true things without armor, "I'm also angry, properly, cleanly angry, for perhaps the first time. Not at the night itself, but at the years after it, at myself, for how long I let it hold me." "That kind of anger," he said, "is the most useful kind." "Is that something you know from experience?" "It is," he said. And the plainness of it, the unembellished honesty of it, settled something in her. Not everything, not even most things, but something. She looked at the room around them, at the dancers beginning to reassemble for another set, at the clusters of conversation and the movement of silk and the summer candlelight over all of it. And she felt the difference between being inside it and standing at its edges as a physical sensation, like temperature. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you told me, on the dance floor. That the people who laughed were wrong." "Yes, I've been telling myself a version of that for 8 years," she said. "But I was only half believing it. I was keeping the doubt around because it felt safer than—" She stopped, found the next words. "Safer than believing I deserved more than what I was giving myself." He didn't look away. He didn't fill the silence with reassurance or validation or any of the comfortable things that would have made the moment easier and smaller. He just waited. And she stood inside the waiting, and something in her recognized it for what it was. Not emptiness, but space. Room to finish the thought on her own terms. "I think," she said slowly, "that you may have been right about the difference between what was done to me and what I chose." She held his gaze. "I am not sure yet what to do with that, but I am no longer prepared to pretend I don't know it." Daniel Morgan looked at her with those serious, steady, dark eyes. And then he said the last thing she expected. "There's something I haven't told you yet," he said. "Something about why I know your father's name, and your mother's, and why I knew what you were wearing the night of the Worthington Assembly, as if I'd kept account of it." His voice was measured, careful. The voice of a man approaching something with a specific care of someone who knows the weight of what they're carrying. "Something that's been true a great deal longer than 8 years, Miss Hart, and that I think you deserve to know all of it. Tonight." She looked at him. Her heart had resumed its new, slow, foundational rhythm. "Then tell me," she said. "Then tell me," she said. And he did. Not there, not in the middle of the Harrington ballroom with half of New York's social world circling them like weather. But he tilted his head toward the far corridor, the one that led to the Harringtons' reading room, which would be empty at this hour. And she followed him without asking why. Because something in the gravity of his voice had told her that whatever was coming required walls and quiet and the absence of an audience. The reading room held 2 chairs, and the smell of old paper and the distant sound of the music filtering through from the ballroom, muffled and small. Daniel Morgan stood with his back to the window and his hands at his sides, and he looked like a man about to do something that frightened him, which was the most surprising thing Catherine had seen all evening, because she was becoming fairly certain that very little frightened Daniel Morgan. "My father," he said, "and your father knew each other." Catherine went still. "Not socially," he continued. "In business. Your father came to New York in 1804, 3 years before you did, to arrange a series of investments with several partners here. My father was one of them." He paused. "The arrangement was, it was not equal. My father had more capital, more connections, more leverage in the city. Your father had the land holdings in Connecticut and a reputation that opened certain doors." Another pause. "My father used that arrangement to his advantage in ways that were not entirely honest." She watched his face. "What does that mean, Mr. Morgan?" "It means," he said, "that when the partnership dissolved in 1806, your father came away with considerably less than he should have, considerably less than the agreement had specified, and he was advised, strongly advised, not to pursue the matter through legal channels. Because my father had more lawyers and more friends in more important places, and your father had a daughter he was planning to bring to New York the following spring, and didn't want to arrive under a cloud." The music from the ballroom filtered through the walls, something bright and easy that felt entirely wrong as a backdrop for what she was hearing. "My father," Catherine said slowly, "was cheated." "Yes." Daniel didn't soften it. "By mine." She sat with that for a moment, turned it over, held it up against everything she knew about the years after her father's death. The careful management of reduced circumstances. The decisions her mother had made that Catherine had never fully understood. The way certain opportunities had simply never materialized the way they should have for a family with a Hart name and the Hart land. "He never told me," she said. "He wouldn't have. He was protecting you." Daniel's voice was even, but the effort of keeping it that way was visible now, in the set of his jaw, in the way his hands had moved slightly from his sides. "He told my father, in their final meeting, that he had a daughter who was coming to New York, and that he wanted no shadow from their business to fall on her. My father agreed to keep the matter private." A pause that had weight in it. "I found my father's correspondence after his death, 4 years ago, the full record of it." "And when you found it," Catherine said, and her voice came out very careful, "what did you do?" "I came to find you." He said it simply. "I'd known for years by then. The watching from across rooms, the knowing your name, all of it. I had been waiting for the right moment. And when I found those letters, I understood that waiting was no longer something I was entitled to." He looked at her directly. "I came to 3 events in the fall of 1811 with the intention of telling you, and at each one, you stood at the wall in a dress designed to make you invisible, and I stood across the room trying to find the right way to walk up to a woman who had made every part of herself say, 'Do not approach,' and I—" He stopped. "You what?" she said. "I failed," he said flatly. 3 times. I told myself I was waiting for a better moment. I was lying to myself. I was a coward again, the same cowardice as the Worthington Assembly, dressed up in different clothes." She stood and looked at him, and thought about 1811, about those 3 autumn events she barely remembered because she had attended them with the same mechanical detachment she brought to all social obligations in those years. She thought about whether she had noticed him at any of them and was horrified to realize she genuinely didn't know, because she had spent those years looking at floors and walls and the middle distance between people, specifically to avoid the kind of eye contact that might accidentally invite interaction. "The correspondence," she said. "My father's letters. They're in your possession?" "Yes." "And the financial records of the original agreement?" "Yes." "Daniel." She used his given name without deciding to, and felt them both register it. A small shift in the room's temperature. "Are you telling me that there is documentation, legal documentation, of what your father did?" "I am." "And you have had it for 4 years?" "Yes." She looked at him. She thought about her mother, still living in the Hartford house, managing with the careful arithmetic of a woman who had spent 20 years making reduced circumstances look like dignity. She thought about the land her father had been meant to keep and hadn't. She thought about every closed door and every quiet sacrifice dressed up as a preference. And she felt something move through her that was not grief and not anger exactly, but something older and larger than both. "Why?" she said, and her voice was steady. She made it steady. "Are you telling me this tonight?" "Because it's yours to know," he said. "It has always been yours to know. I should have found a way to tell you years ago, and I did not. And I cannot give you back the time that cost you. But I can give you what I have now." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, thick, several pages, and held it toward her. "I've had my solicitor prepare a formal accounting of what was taken, what the current value would be, and what I intend to return to you and your mother." She stared at the document in his hand. "You intend to return it," she said. "Every cent, with the interest of 20 years. His voice was the most stripped down she'd heard it all evening. No performance, no management, nothing but the plain architecture of a decision that had clearly been arrived at long ago and simply waited for this moment to be spoken. "It's not mine. It never was. And whatever you decide about me after tonight, that fact does not change." She didn't take the document. Not yet. She stood and looked at his extended hand and thought about 8 years, about reduced circumstances dressed as dignity, about gray dresses and walls, and the careful arithmetic of a woman who had stopped believing she deserved the center of any room. "I need to ask you something," she said. "And I need you to answer me honestly." "Yes." "Is this the telling me tonight, the dancing, the conversation, all of it?" She held his gaze. "Is any of this about managing your conscience? About the Morgan name and what your father did? And the particular discomfort of a man who found letters in a dead man's desk and has been trying to figure out what to do with them ever since?" The question landed hard. She watched it land, watched him take it full in the face without stepping back from it. "Yes," he said. She blinked. "Partly," he said. "I will not lie to you and tell you the two things are entirely separate, because they are not. I found my father's letters, and I thought about you differently after that. Not for the first time, but with more urgency. With the specific urgency of a man who understood he owed a debt and wanted to pay it." He paused. "But I need you to understand that I knew your name before those letters. I watched you walk off that floor in 1807, and I thought about it for 4 years before I ever found my father's correspondence. And what I feel when I stand in a room with you is not—" He stopped, chose the next words with the care of a man who understood their weight. "It is not the feeling of a debt being discharged. That I can promise you." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the specific difficulty of believing a thing you wanted to be true, and how that wanting made the believing suspect, and how the suspicion was its own kind of prison. "I believe you," she said. It surprised her, the ease of it. The way it came out without the familiar hedging, without the protective qualification she typically wrapped around anything that made her feel exposed. Just, "I believe you." He exhaled. Something in him released, visible in his shoulders, in the set of his face, in the slight easing of that contained, vigilant quality that she'd been watching all evening. As if he'd been holding something in a very tight grip for a very long time, and had just been told he could put it down. She took the document from his hand. She didn't open it. She held it and felt its weight. The weight of paper and ink and 20 years of something that had been wrong and was being made less wrong in the only way still available to the living. And she thought about her mother in Hartford and her father who had protected her from all of it, and the particular love in that protection and the particular cost of it. "I'll need to speak with the solicitor," she said. "Of course. And my mother will need to be involved in any final arrangement." "Whatever you wish." "And She stopped. The next thing she'd been about to say surprised her, caught her off guard, arrived from somewhere she hadn't been monitoring. "I want to know more about my father, about what he was like in his dealings, what the letters say about him." Her voice had gone quieter, not fragile, just true. "I want to know what kind of man he was when no one was protecting me from knowing." Daniel Morgan looked at her with something in his face that she didn't have a clean word for. "He was a good man," he said, "careful and honest, and too trusting in one specific instance. The letters make that clear." He paused. "He mentioned you by name, more than once." She pressed her lips together, held the document a little more firmly. "All right," she said. She breathed. "All right." They stood in the reading room with the muffled music of the ballroom on the other side of the wall, and the weight of everything that had been said settling into the space between them, and Catherine turned the document over in her hands and thought about the specific difficulty of holding two true things simultaneously: gratitude and anger, relief and grief, the warmth of being seen and the long cold of having not been. "I owe you an apology," Daniel said. She looked up. "For which part?" "For not finding a way to be braver sooner." He said it without self-pity, without the performance of guilt that asks to be relieved. "For the Worthington Assembly and the 4 years after it, and the 3 events in 1811, where I stood across rooms and went home and told myself tomorrow would be easier. For every one of those days." "That's a great many apologies," Catherine said. Yes. He didn't argue with that. She looked at him. She thought about what it cost a person to stand in front of someone and list their failures plainly, without dressing them up, without asking for absolution, just laying them out. The way you lay out the truth of a thing when you've decided the truth is the only thing worth offering. "I don't know what this is," she said. She meant all of it. The evening, the document in her hands, the particular warmth of standing 2 feet from him in a room that contained only the two of them. "I don't know what any of tonight means for whatever comes next." "That's fair," he said. "I'm not—" She paused, found the honest shape of it. "I'm not a woman who trusts easily. I was not that woman even before 1807, and the last 8 years have not improved the condition. I know. I'm telling you so you don't mistake my being here, talking to you, taking this—" She held up the document slightly. "For more than what it is, which is a beginning, if it's anything at all." "A beginning is all I'm asking for," he said. "Don't ask for anything yet," she said, not unkindly. "We've known each other for 3 hours." Something that was definitively a smile moved across his face. Brief, real, unguarded in a way that completely rearranged her understanding of what his face was capable of. "4," he said. We've known each other for 8 years and 4 hours." She looked at him. She felt the almost smile again, and this time she stopped fighting it. It arrived, small and genuine and entirely unpracticed, and she let it. "That's not how time works, Mr. Morgan." "It is how I've been keeping count," he said. She shook her head, but the smile stayed, and for a moment they simply stood there, the two of them, in the quiet of the reading room. And it wasn't the charged, careful silence of two people managing each other anymore. It was something easier than that, something that felt, cautiously, like the beginning of a thing that had a different texture than caution. Then the door opened. It was not Eliza. It was not Mrs. Hartwell. It was not Margaret Davenport or anyone else she might have braced for. It was Thomas Aldridge, Jane's husband, a tall, serious man who moved in financial and legal circles, and whose expression, as he looked between the two of them, was not the expression of a man who had wandered into the wrong room. "Morgan," Thomas Aldridge said, "I thought I might find you here." His eyes moved to Catherine, and something in them shifted. Recognition, and beneath it, something more complicated. "Miss Hart, I'm glad you're both—" "I need a word." Daniel straightened. "Now?" "Now." Thomas Aldridge stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind him, and his voice dropped to the register of a man delivering news he would have preferred not to be delivering. "I've just spoken with Henry Ware." "You know who Henry Ware is?" "The magistrate," Daniel said. "The magistrate's associate," Thomas corrected. "Which is relevant, because apparently—" He stopped, looked at Catherine again. "Miss Hart, what I'm about to say is connected to your family's history in this city. I think you should hear it." Catherine looked at him steadily. "Then say it. There is a man named Gideon Cole." Thomas Aldridge said the name with the careful precision of someone disarming something. "He's a solicitor, not a reputable one, but a functional one, who has been engaged by certain parties to contest the land holdings your father maintained in Connecticut. Specifically, to argue that the original transfer of certain properties was improperly documented, and that the current holdings are therefore legally uncertain." The warmth left the room. "On whose behalf?" Daniel said, and his voice had gone entirely flat. Thomas looked at him steadily. "The Davenport family." The silence lasted 2 full seconds. "Margaret's father," Catherine said. "Her father's legal representative, acting with her father's money," Thomas confirmed. "The action has been in preparation for approximately 8 months. I became aware of it only recently through Ware's associate, and I came tonight specifically because—" He glanced at Daniel. "Because I knew you were here, and I knew you had been arranging matters. And because someone needed to tell Miss Hart before she read it in a document served to her door." Catherine stood very still and let the information move through her like cold water. 8 months. The Davenport family had been building a legal challenge to a family's land for 8 months, while Margaret Davenport stood in ballrooms, smiling her nailed smile and commenting on gray dresses, and pretending their history was nothing more than the distant memory of a social embarrassment. "Can they succeed?" she asked. Her voice was level. She was faintly amazed by how level it was. "That depends," Thomas said carefully, "on what documentation exists to counter the challenge." She looked at the document still in her hand. Then she looked at Daniel Morgan. He was already looking at her. He had been looking at her from the moment Thomas said Davenport family, with an expression that was not surprise, she realized. It was not the expression of a man hearing something he hadn't anticipated. "You knew," she said. "I suspected," he said. "Not the timeline, not how far along it was, but—" His jaw set. "When I found my father's correspondence, there were letters from Davenport Sr. as well. He and my father had their own arrangements over the years, and some of those arrangements touched on the Connecticut holdings. I didn't understand why until tonight. His eyes were steady on hers. When I saw you at this event, and I saw Margaret's face when she looked at you, something... He stopped. I should have moved faster. I should have told you all of it immediately, instead of dancing with me, she said. Yes. And having 3 hours of conversation. Yes. She looked at him. She looked at the document in her hand. She thought about 8 years of gray dresses and walls, and the careful geometry of invisibility. And she thought about the fact that, while she had been practicing disappearance, the people who had driven her into it had been constructing something else entirely. Something with legal dimensions. Something designed not merely to humiliate her, but to take the last material thing her family had. She thought about her mother in Hartford. Something solidified in her. Something she didn't have a clean word for. Not anger, though the anger was there, clean and cold and useful. Something older and more fundamental than anger. The specific quality of a woman who has just understood the full scope of what has been done to her, and has decided, with absolute clarity, that she is finished allowing it. She turned to Thomas Aldridge. What do I need to do? You need a solicitor, he said. Tonight is not... There's nothing that can be done tonight. But first thing in the morning, I'll have one by morning, Daniel said. Daniel? Catherine looked at him. Her voice was quiet. I appreciate that. I do. But this is my family's matter, and I will arrange my own solicitor. He looked at her for a moment. All right. No argument. No insistence. Just, all right. However, she continued, the documentation you have, the letters and the financial records, I will need access to those, with proper legal oversight. You'll have everything, he said. Every page, every letter, anything I have that touches your family's interests. It's yours. Thomas Aldridge looked between them with the expression of a man who had expected to walk into a difficult conversation and had found something considerably more complicated than he'd prepared for. I'll speak with Ware's associate tonight, he said. Find out how far along the challenge is. Buy some time if I can. Do that, Catherine said. He nodded, and with one more glance at Daniel that communicated a conversation they would be having in private at the earliest opportunity, he left the room. Catherine stood in the silence that followed and breathed. In, out. She felt the document in her hand, the weight of it, and she thought about how an evening that had begun with her pressing her back against a wall and wishing to disappear had arrived here, in a reading room with a legal document and a conspiracy and the specific, clean-burning clarity of a woman who understood finally and completely that she had run out of reasons to make herself small. She looked at Daniel Morgan. 8 years, she said. Yes. They spent 8 years, all of them, building things, while I spent mine disappearing. Yes, he said. He didn't soften it. That, she said, is finished. He looked at her, and something in his face shifted into what she was beginning to recognize as his version of certainty. Quiet, unhurried, and absolute. I know, he said. I can see that. She straightened. She folded the document carefully and held it. And she thought about tomorrow morning and a solicitor and letters in her father's handwriting, and a mother in Hartford who deserved to know the truth of what had been done to them. She thought about Margaret Davenport's face in the corridor. He is a man with a problem. Said by a woman whose father had been spending the last 8 months trying to take everything they had left. She thought about a dance floor and a gray dress, and the first man who had said her name in 8 years like it was something worth saying. I have one more question, she said. Ask it. She met his eyes. When you said, earlier, that you were waiting for someone, that you would not marry Margaret Davenport. She kept her voice measured, held his gaze straight and steady. "Were you telling the truth?" Daniel Morgan looked at her for one long, unhurried moment. The kind of moment that has no performance in it, no calculation, no management of impressions. "Catherine," he said, the first time he had used her given name all evening, "I have been telling you nothing but the truth since the moment I said your name." She held that, let it settle, let herself believe it without immediately reaching for the reasons not to. "Good," she said. "Then I suggest we go back into that ballroom, together, and let every person in that room see exactly what they're looking at." He held out his hand. She took it. They walked back into the ballroom together, and the room noticed. Not with the cruel attention of 8 years ago, not with the gathered momentum of a crowd that had decided on its cruelty in an anteroom. This was different. This was the particular noticing of a room that had already been watching something develop all evening and was now seeing its conclusion announced, not in words, but in the simple, undeniable fact of two people crossing a threshold, side by side, unhurried, with no apology in either of their faces. Catherine felt every eye that moved toward them. She counted them the way she always counted them, the old reflex, the practiced arithmetic of threat assessment. And then she stopped counting. She let her hand rest in the crook of Daniel Morgan's arm, and she walked into the noise and the heat and the summer candlelight, and she let them look. Eliza found her in under 20 seconds. "You were gone for 40 minutes, Eliza said, falling into step on Catherine's other side, her voice pitched low with the urgency of a woman who had been managing her anxiety through sheer social performance and was now cashing in. "I told 3 separate people you had a headache." "I have run out of plausible headache details." "I don't have a headache," Catherine said. Clearly, Eliza's eyes moved to Daniel, then back to Catherine's face, reading something there that visibly recalibrated her alarm into something more complicated. "Are you all right?" "I'm going to be," Catherine said, and meant it in a way she hadn't meant anything in a very long time. Eliza looked at her for one more second, the careful look of a woman who loved her and was deciding whether to push. Then she nodded, once, and fell back to give them room. Daniel leaned slightly toward her. "You don't have to stay. If you'd rather leave—" "I'm not leaving," Catherine said. "The room is going to talk." "The room has been talking about me since 1807, she said. "Tonight is the first time in 8 years they've had something accurate to say." He was quiet for a moment. "That may be the most defiant thing I've heard all evening." "Get used to it," she said. And something in him, she felt it more than saw it, a shift in the quality of his stillness, a kind of warmth that came through his arm into hers, settled, as if some final uncertainty he'd been carrying had just been set down. They had crossed approximately half the ballroom when Margaret Davenport stepped into their path. Not the way she'd stepped into Catherine's path in the corridor. That had been calculated, chosen, the movement of a woman who had selected her terrain. This was different. Margaret's face, as she looked at the two of them together, had none of the practiced architecture of earlier in the evening. What was there instead was raw and unmanaged and entirely more honest. And what it told Catherine in the space of 2 seconds was that whatever Margaret had expected to happen tonight, this was not it. "Daniel," Margaret said. Not Mr. Morgan. Daniel. The name said with a familiarity that was entirely performative. Thrown out like a rope she expected him to catch. He didn't catch it. "Miss Davenport." The formality landed. Catherine watched Margaret absorb it. "I was hoping to speak with you," Margaret said, and her eyes were moving between the two of them with the rapid, recalculating energy of someone whose plan has developed an unexpected structural failure. "There are matters I think require—" "There are matters," Daniel said, that my solicitor will be in contact with your father's solicitor about. In the morning. His voice was the flattest Catherine had heard it all evening. Not cold. Colder than cold. The specific temperature of a man who has removed all performance from a situation and left only the mechanism. Any conversation beyond that, Miss Davenport, can wait for that context. Margaret's breath audibly caught. The color moved in her face, a tide going out. I don't know what you think I think, Daniel said, that I found my father's letters 4 years ago, and I have been deciding ever since what a man of conscience does with them. I've made that decision. Anything else we need to say to each other can be said in the presence of legal counsel. The music in the far corner chose that moment to swing into something fuller, a waltz with enough volume to swallow the silence that followed. Margaret looked at Catherine, and Catherine looked back at her, with the clean, direct, unarmored gaze of a woman who has finally stopped rationing herself. "Good night, Margaret," Catherine said. It was not said with triumph. It was not said with cruelty. It was said the way you say a thing that is simply true and requires no additional decoration. Margaret Davenport turned and walked away, and this time, Catherine didn't watch her go. She turned to Daniel instead, and the look on his face, the particular quality of a man seeing something for the first time that he had expected, but not prepared for the actual reality of, made something in her chest open quietly, like a window in a room that has been closed too long. "You didn't need me for that," he said. "No," she agreed. "I didn't." He smiled. The full version, not the restrained, near expression she'd been cataloging all evening. The real one, unguarded and genuine. And it completely remade his face into something that was considerably more dangerous than the coldly contained version she'd been managing all night. She looked away before it could do more damage than she was prepared to assess right now. Thomas Aldridge reappeared at Daniel's shoulder with the face of a man who had been busy. "I spoke with Ware's associate," he said, low and direct. "The challenge has been filed, but not yet served. There's a window, 10 days, perhaps 2 weeks, before it reaches the Hartford house." "That's enough time," Daniel said. "For what?" Catherine asked. "For my solicitor to file a counter-documentation with a full financial record of the original partnership agreement," Daniel said, "which establishes not only the legitimacy of your family's holdings, but the circumstances under which they were reduced, and who was responsible." He met her eyes. "Filed alongside a formal acknowledgement from me regarding the Morgan family's role in those circumstances." She stared at him. "You would put that in a legal document? Your own family's?" "It's already true," he said. "Making it documented doesn't make it more true. It just makes it harder to ignore." Thomas was watching the two of them with the expression of a man who had come tonight expecting one type of evening and was leaving having witnessed something considerably outside his experience. "I'll reach out to your man first thing," he told Daniel, and then to Catherine, with a gravity that felt genuine. "Miss Hart, I'm sorry this has been going on without your knowledge. You should have been told sooner." "Yes," she said. "I should have been." She looked at Daniel. "By several people, for several different reasons." Daniel held her gaze and didn't flinch from it. "Agreed." Thomas removed himself with the tact of a man who understood when a private conversation needed to happen, and made his exit accordingly. They were standing near the edge of the floor now, close enough to the dancers that the music had texture and warmth, and Catherine looked at the couples moving through the waltz figures, and thought about the first dance, 3 hours ago, the terror of stepping onto the floor, the way her body had remembered everything her fear had tried to make it forget. "I need to tell my mother," she said. "Yes." "She's going to..." It will be difficult for her, learning the full truth of what your father did." She paused. "And learning there was documentation of it and neither of us knew." "I understand that." He said it without deflecting. "I intend to write to her myself. Whatever I can do to make that easier." "A letter is a beginning," Catherine said. "But she's going to want to look the person in the eye eventually." She looked at him sideways. "You should be prepared for that." "I am." "My mother is not soft," Catherine said. "She has spent 20 years being graceful under circumstances that didn't deserve grace from her, and she is going to have opinions." "I'd expect nothing less," he said. And then, quietly, "She sounds a great deal like her daughter." Catherine looked at him. The almost smile was back, and this time she didn't fight it, didn't manage it, just let it arrive. Then, from somewhere across the room, she heard a voice carry over the music, and she knew the voice immediately, because it was the voice she'd been listening for the negative space of all evening. The voice that had defined her social geography for 8 years by its potential presence and its demonstrated cruelty. "I heard," Margaret Davenport was saying to someone, loudly, with the particular carrying volume of a woman who intended to be overheard, "that the Hart family's situation in Hartford is considerably more uncertain than they've let on. The land—" "Miss Davenport." The voice that cut across Margaret's was not Daniel's. It was not Thomas Aldridge's. It was Eliza Fenwick's, bright, sharp, with a precision in it that Catherine had never heard from Eliza before. The voice of a woman who had been listening all evening and had finally found her moment. "I wonder," Eliza said, clear enough for the surrounding cluster of people to hear, "if you're aware that several of the people in this room tonight are familiar with the Morgan family correspondence that Mr. Morgan has recently had reviewed by counsel? Correspondence that touches on a number of business arrangements from the early part of this decade." A beat, perfectly placed. Arrangements involving, among others, the Davenport family. The ripple moved through the nearby crowd. Catherine felt it. The specific shift of attention, the recalibration of allegiances, the way a room full of people who trade in information and reputation reorients when new data enters the system. Margaret's voice, when it came, was several notes higher than usual. "I don't know what you think I think," Eliza said pleasantly, "that you've been talking about Catherine Hart for 8 years, and that tonight seems like an excellent evening to try something different." She paused. "Don't you?" The silence that followed had the quality of something that has been building for a very long time and has finally found its release. Catherine stood very still and let it happen. She didn't look at Margaret. She looked at Eliza, her bright-eyed, relentless, entirely underestimated friend, who had spent 3 hours tonight watching and waiting, and had apparently decided that if an opportunity arose to say the thing that needed saying, she was the woman to say it. "I owe her significantly more than a glass of lemonade," Catherine said quietly. "Yes," Daniel said, "you do." Margaret Davenport made her exit. Not a graceful one. The kind of exit that announces itself through velocity, and the rigid set of shoulders, and the very particular energy of someone who has just lost control of a narrative they have been managing for years. Several pairs of eyes followed her. Then those eyes moved to Catherine. This time, the looking felt different. Not the predatory assessment of a crowd deciding on a target. Something more like the recalibration she'd anticipated. People looking and seeing, for the first time, what had actually been in front of them. Reassembling the story with new information, arriving at different conclusions. Mrs. Hartwell, to Catherine's considerable surprise, crossed the room toward her. Not with the bright-nailed smile of earlier, with a more careful expression. The expression of a woman who has done social arithmetic and arrived at a new sum. "Miss Hart," she said, I wonder if I might have been hasty in some of my earlier observations this evening. Catherine looked at her steadily. Which ones? Mrs. Hartwell had the grace to look uncomfortable. Your dress is quite striking, actually, the more I consider it. She paused. I hope you'll forgive an old woman's thoughtlessness. It was not a magnificent apology. It was the small, self-interested sort that comes from a woman who has sensed the wind changing and is adjusting her sails. Catherine knew the difference between that and genuine remorse. She also knew that 8 years ago, she would have been so grateful for any form of social acceptance that she would have seized on this and treated it as more than it was. Tonight, she simply nodded. Of course, Mrs. Hartwell. And let it be exactly what it was, neither more nor less. Mrs. Hartwell moved on. Daniel watched her go. That cost her something, he said. Not much, Catherine said, but something. Progress, he said, rarely starts magnificent. She thought about that. She thought about the first dance, and the almost smile that had kept escaping her, and the document folded in her hand, and her mother in Hartford, and a father who had protected her from a truth she could have handled if anyone had trusted her with it. She thought about 8 years of gray. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask. When this is resolved, she chose her words with care, aware of the specific weight of what she was navigating. The legal matter, the documentation, all of it. When it's settled and done, and my mother's situation is properly addressed, she met his eyes. What do you want? From me? From whatever this is? He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, considering. I want, he said slowly, to be someone you trust. Not because I've paid a debt, or because I have documentation that helps you, but because you've decided, with full information, that I'm worth trusting. He paused. I want to have conversations like the ones we've had tonight, regularly. Preferably not always in borrowed rooms while your friend creates distractions and a solicitor appears with alarming news. Another pause, and the corner of his mouth moved. I want to stop watching you from across rooms. She held his gaze, held the weight of what he'd said, the plainness of it, the way he'd offered it without embellishment or strategy, just the clean shape of what he actually wanted. That's a reasonable list, she said. I'm a reasonable man. You're a man who walked up to a woman he'd been watching for 8 years and led with a confession, she said. Reasonable is debatable. Effective, though, he said. She looked at him, and she felt it, the specific, slightly terrifying warmth of a door opening. Not thrown open, not crashed through, but opening, carefully, on hinges that had been rusted shut for a very long time, and were moving again, with the particular reluctance of things that have forgotten they were meant to move. I'd like to dance again, she said. He didn't say anything. He held out his hand, and she took it, and they moved onto the floor together for the second time that evening. And this time, the room was watching them from the start. And this time, Catherine did not spend the first 3 figures looking at his face to avoid looking at the crowd. She looked at the crowd. She looked at the faces of the people who had made up the geography of her social world for 8 years, the people she had been mapping and calculating and managing around. And she looked at them from the center of the floor, from the place she had been avoiding since 1807, the place that had been taken from her, not by force, but by fear. And she felt what the floor felt like when you were standing on it without apology. It felt like ground. It felt like ground that had always been there, that had always been capable of holding her weight, that she had avoided so long she'd forgotten it had nothing to do with the people standing around it. You're not counting, Daniel said. No, she said. I'm done counting. They danced through the first figure and the second, and somewhere in the third, something released in her body. Not a dramatic collapse of tension, nothing that would be visible to the people watching, but something internal and fundamental, like a fist that had been clenched for 8 years, finally, cautiously, partially opening. She was thinking about her father's letters, about sitting down in a room, probably in the morning, probably with a legal document in one hand and a letter in the other, and reading her father's handwriting and learning who he was when no one was managing what she knew. She felt the grief of that already, anticipatory and clean, and she let herself feel it, rather than filing it away for later. She was thinking about her mother, about the particular conversation that was coming, the one where she would have to tell a woman who had been graceful about reduced circumstances for 2 decades that there had been nothing graceful necessary, that it had been taken, and there was now a path to taking it back. She was thinking about gray dresses, and what she would wear to the next event she attended, and whether it would occur to her to reach for gray, and what it would feel like if it didn't. "What are you thinking?" Daniel asked. "Many things," she said. "Which one is loudest?" She considered that. She went through the layers of what was moving through her, the legal and the familial and the historical, and the cautious warmth of the door opening on its rusted hinges. And she found the thing underneath all of it, the simplest one, the one that had been there since the first figure of the first dance, when her body had remembered the steps, and she had heard herself make a sound she hadn't intended. "That I missed this," she said. "Dancing. More than I let myself know I missed it." He looked at her. "What else?" "That 8 years is a very long time," she said. "And also, tonight, it doesn't quite feel that long." He turned her through the final figure, and they came to rest, and the music fell away, and the applause moved through the room. And Catherine Hart stood in the center of the Harrington Ballroom in the summer of 1815 in a gray dress, and she did not look at the walls. She looked at Daniel Morgan. He looked back at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because some things had moved past the point where words were the right instrument for them, and this was one of those moments. Eliza appeared at her elbow. "For what it's worth," she said cheerfully, "Margaret Davenport has left the building, and half the room is now discussing how the Morgan family documentation is going to make the next 3 months very interesting for several long-established families." She paused. "Also, Mrs. Harrington has told 2 people that she always thought you had excellent bearing, which is absolutely a lie, but very much in the right direction." "Thank you, Eliza," Catherine said, "for what you did." Eliza waved her hand. "I have been wanting to say that to that woman since 1809. You gave me the occasion. I thank you." She looked between Catherine and Daniel with the expression of a woman who had drawn a conclusion and was very pleased with it. "I'm going to go have some lemonade," she announced, and vanished with the specific purposefulness of a person removing themselves tactfully from a scene they had helped orchestrate. Daniel looked at the doorway through which Eliza had disappeared. "You have very good friends." "I have one very good friend," Catherine said. "I think I'd stopped noticing how good." She paused. "There are a number of things I'd stopped noticing." "And now?" She looked around the room, at the faces, the movement, the summer heat and the candlelight, and the ordinary ongoing life of a gathering that had provided, tonight, the unlikely theater for something she did not yet have the full language for. She looked at Thomas Aldridge across the room, who raised his glass to her slightly, the quiet acknowledgement of a man who would do what he said he would do. She looked at the door where Margaret Davenport was no longer standing. She looked at the dance floor, where she had stood tonight, twice, in a gray dress, and felt the ground hold her. "I have a solicitor to retain," she said, "and a letter to write to my mother tonight, before I sleep, because she needs to know what's coming before it arrives at her door." She felt the list of it settling into her, the weight of what tomorrow held, and found that the weight felt different than it would have this morning. less like a burden, more like traction. I have 8 years of decisions to examine, and probably a significant portion of them to revise. I have a legal matter that is going to require attention and courage, and the willingness to put my family's history in front of people who will have opinions about it. She met his eyes. I have a great deal of work ahead of me. Yes, he said. You do. And I am, she said, with the particular steadiness of a woman who has just found her footing after a very long time of standing on uncertain ground. Entirely prepared to do it. She held out her hand to him, not the way you hold out your hand for a dance, but the way you hold it out when you've made a decision, and you're extending it as the physical expression of that decision. Its first real gesture in the world. He took it. Both hands, briefly, the warm, certain grip she'd felt on the dance floor, and then he released it, because it wasn't the time for more than that, and they both knew it, and that shared knowing felt like its own kind of beginning. Catherine Hart walked out of the Harrington ballroom that night with her head up, her back straight, and the document folded in her hand, the paperweight of a wrong being made right, of a truth that had been kept from her finally being returned to where it belonged. She walked out into the summer night, and she thought about gray dresses and walls and the careful arithmetic of making herself cost nothing. And she thought about what it had taken, and what it had cost, and what it had finally given her back. She thought about her father's words and letters she hadn't yet read, and her mother's grace that had never been resigned, but always fierce, and the woman who had walked off a dance floor with her head up 8 years ago, while a room laughed. And she understood, finally, that that woman had never been defeated. She had only been waiting. Catherine Hart was done waiting. She had reclaimed her name, her ground, and her place in the world. And no one, not Margaret Davenport, not the ghost of a bad father's business dealings, not 8 years of gray dresses and borrowed invisibility, would ever take them from her again.